I'm excited to welcome this week's Tiara Talk Show guest, Disney legend Tom Nabbe, to the show. Welcome, Tom.
Well, thank you, Tammy. Looking forward to it. Listened to a couple of your interviews, the one with Jane Jackson and Randy Wright's kids. Jane and I worked together at World, and Randy and I worked together at Disneyland. And you did a great job on those. So hopefully we do the same thing here.
Oh, now you're putting the pressure on me, Tom. I'll try. I'm going to try my best. Because it's so interesting. We first met, we were just talking about this off air for our listeners, but we first met at the Retro Magic event at the Contemporary, literally almost a year ago as of recording this interview. And it was such a pleasure to meet you. And so many Disney fans kept coming up to you. You know, I kind of pulled back because it was like 400 people there, and it was a time of glory for so many of you who were there, especially yourself. And it was just great to see all of you together and, you know, different mishmash of people, but your history all together is just fantastic through Disney. And I think a lot of people don't realize that aside from being Tom Sawyer, I think you started out technically as a newsie, and that was one of the first jobs you had at Disneyland, correct?
Yeah, I consider myself an independent contractor. I started out as a newspaper boy selling the at that time it's called the Disneyland News, and it was a newspaper that was published once a month, and it pretty much told the history of Disneyland, coming events, and a little bit about the park and the lessees. The lessees were the people that ran all the restaurants and merchandise locations inside Disneyland. Only the people that worked the attractions, worked in administration, and worked in maintenance actually worked for Walt Disney Incorporated. And the rest were worked for people that had contracts to operate the various concessions.
So as a newsie, can you kind of discuss your responsibilities throughout the day? Like, how early would you have to get up to complete your work? And what time during the day would you kind of conclude and then be able maybe to kind of explore Disneyland throughout the rest of the day?
Yeah, well, let's, if you like, let's back up just a little bit. And when we moved to Anaheim from Los Angeles, I wanted to get a paper route, but Anaheim was considered rural, and I had to be 16 and have a driver's license. Well, I was only 12 years old, so that wasn't going to happen. But I got a Sunday paper route and developed about 25 customers in the neighborhood, and then my manager would drop off whatever extra papers he had, and I would ride over to the Harbor Gate and sell Sunday newspapers to the construction employees as they were going home on Sunday morning. And that's how I met Ray Ahmet. And Joe, his brother, ran the concession of Castle News on Main Street. And he basically told me after the park opened, if I wanted to sell newspapers, to show up early in the morning, and he'd give me 100 newspapers, and if I sold 100 newspapers outside the gate, I could come into the park and continue to sell newspapers throughout the day.
You were a go-getter. You're only 12 years old at this time?
Oh, yeah. Well, in Los Angeles, I started selling newspapers up at the Coliseum for football games to earn enough money to buy a bicycle so I could get a paper route in my neighborhood in Los Angeles. So a little bit of an entrepreneur, type thing, and I didn't have any problem in the sales side of it. So
yeah, well, obviously you caught the attention as soon as you went into Main Street. Do you remember the first interaction you had with Walt?
Yeah, it was actually, well, one of them was my mother got his autograph on opening day in 1955, but I wasn't there at that moment, but she got his autograph. that's a little different story. But somebody had told me they were going to build Tom Sawyer's Island, and Walt was in the park quite frequently during that time. He'd come down on Friday afternoon and spend Friday night and Saturday night in his apartment on Main Street. And then he'd get up and walk around the park and do whatever he did business-wise at Disneyland, and then drive back up to the studio on Sunday. Well, it was on one of those days. There was a little break area by the Jungle Cruise storage area where they stored the boats, and Walt was walking by there to go to his apartment. And I introduced myself, and I told him that I had heard he was going to build Tom Sawyer's Island, and I looked just like Tom Sawyer, and he should hire me. Well, he didn't say yes, but he didn't say no. He said he'd think about it, so he left the door open, and I'm a pretty persistent person. So anytime I could find Walt after that, I'd ask him if he was still thinking about hiring me to be Tom Sawyer. Now, there are a couple other things. When I worked for Joe and Ray selling the newspapers, if you look at the front of Disneyland, on the left-hand side, there's a merchandise stand called the newsstand. Well, back in 1955, that was actually a newsstand, and they had all the newspapers from around the country. And one of the jobs that I weaseled myself into was Joe and Ray would pull all the editorial pages and front pages out of the local newspapers, and I would take them up to Eddie Meck's office. Eddie was the manager of publicity for Disneyland. And so I developed a rapport with him because he would look for any stories related to Disneyland in the papers. And so almost every day I was up at Eddie's office dropping off newspapers. Well, in turn, anytime they had a publicity shot, that Eddie'd go, "Hey, we're going to use that redheaded kid, that Tom kid. Go find him, and we'll use him in this picture." So I had the opportunity to be in a whole lot of publicity shots in the early 50s, mid 50s, at the opening of Disneyland. One of the things I was able to do in August of 1955, Milton Berle, I don't know if that name means anything to you, and Jerry Lewis were visiting the park. Both of them were major TV stars at the time frame, and both of them were comedians. And they had printed up a newspaper that basically says Disneyland welcomes Jerry and Milty. And I'm staging a shot between those two actors in front of Disneyland with the Disneyland News welcoming them into the park in August of 1955.
This is very amazing to me because you're a kid, and honestly, I think kids are just the people that will be the most blunt and honest with you. So it sounds like you probably were the only one who actually took the time out to introduce yourself to Walt. And I guess everybody kind of knew him. As my dad used to say, he would watch him on TV, in preparation for Disneyland opening. So there's like this legend figure to him. I don't know if you were watching the TV show, but it sounds like you weren't starstruck.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. But Walt, when he was at Disneyland, didn't look like the Walt Disney that you saw on Wednesday night on TV. Mm-hmm. Okay, usually had a 3 days growth of beard. He wore a Panama hat and a dark blue double-breasted blazer and gray pants and a shirt with this little tie that he always had on that was from the Smoke Tree Ranch in Palm Springs. And he would walk out in the morning and talk with all the employees and landscape people and security people and maintenance people. And he'd even talk with the guests until he got inundated with people wanting autographs.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the jobs of the early folks at Disneyland was to help Walt get backstage if he got totally inundated with people wanting autographs. But Walt was, at least to me, was very easy to talk through, and I sort of chalked that up to all the child stars that he had, and Mickey Mouse Club was going real strong during that time frame, and he had two teenage daughters, I think Walt was just a big kid anyway. So
yeah,
we carried on a pretty good conversation. He'd let you talk all the way through, and would answer your questions if you had them, and go from there. Yeah, well, Walt was a listener. This is, I heard from the old timers, is that the old timers would watch Walt, and when that right eyebrow went up, you knew that you had Walt Disney's total attention. So a lot of the old timers were eyebrow watchers.
But when you finally got the position as Tom, what was like a day-to-day thing for you? Were you there Monday through Friday, or were you there every day from like dawn till dusk?
Well, the island was always a seasonal thing. So it was only open on the weekends and holidays during the off-season months. And it was open 7 days a week, mid-June through first part of September. And so it was very much a summer attraction, and that's why wearing cutoffs and straw hat, especially for me with my complexion, was a must because I sunburned so easy.
What was that like to kind of interact with other kids and have fun? It's play, basically.
Well, first of all, I had to have a job. I was the only one in the family working. My stepfather had taken off, and it was just my mother and three sisters. So that was one of the reasons I think I lasted as long as I did, is because I absolutely needed a job. Mm-hmm. A typical day was to come in the morning, and we had two fishing piers opposite the Mark Twain landing, and I would put 25 fishing poles out on each of the piers, and then had little tin cans nailed to the railings, and they had written on them in white paint. The cans were painted brown, and written on them was worms. And part of my job was to fill those cans with potting soil and put the worms in it for bait. And then once the island opened up, people would come over, and probably 50-60% of my job was portraying a face character of Tom Sawyer or Huckleberry Finn. I would answer to either one, depending upon what the guests wanted. I wouldn't answer to Becky Thatcher or India Joe, but in turn, I think I ended up in probably everybody's picture album in the greater Los Angeles area that summer 2-3 times around. And part of the job was people would tangle the lines, so I'd untangle the lines. Sometimes it was to the point where I had to totally replace the lines, so I learned how to build a fishing pole, which had a fishing line on it with a cork and a sinker and a hook. And when we first started, it was a catch and clean program, and there was a little area there that if the guests really wanted to keep the fish, I would take it over and clean it and put it in a plastic bag for them. But that didn't last very long. That only lasted maybe a month, if that long. And old dead fish started showing up in places that you didn't want old dead fish to show up. So we went through and debarbed all the hooks and made it a catch and release program.
For you, how long was the time period of getting to be Tom at Disneyland?
All the way through 1956 through 1961, all through junior high school and high school. That last year, I was really a little too old to be Tom Sawyer, but I was too young to be a ride operator at Disneyland. You had to be 18 years of age in order to be a ride operator. But because I've been around, they kept me on the payroll. But I worked more taking tickets and loading and unloading ramps that last year than I did as Tom Sawyer. I would come in the morning, get the fishing docks all set up. When it got busy, I'd help out on the rafts. And then in the evening, I would put everything away and call it a day. The guys down on the attraction had taught me through the years on how to drive. I used to come in early in the morning and taught me how to drive the rafts. So before I turned 18, I was probably one of the most skilled raft operators at Disneyland. And there's two attractions at Disneyland that you physically had to drive, and that was the keel boats and the rafts. So there was a whole skill set that went around with that. In September of 1961, after I turned 18, it was the last Monday that we were going to be open. So it was on Sunday night. My supervisor again, Jim Hott, he brought down a script for the Jungle Cruise, and he said, Tom, memorize this because Wednesday morning you need to show up for your on-job training at the Jungle Cruise. From there, then I had the opportunity to start working every ride and attraction at Disneyland, and the first one on the list was the Jungle Cruise. So I studied my spiel. I made 3 trips, and I think it was Earl Archer was my trainer. And after the third trip, he says, "Okay, Tom, it's your boat." So after the third trip of OJT training on the Jungle Cruise, I was a qualified Jungle Cruise skipper.
In your opinion, what Disneyland attraction do you think was the most difficult to manage?
Well, the most challenging was the Matterhorn after they built the Matterhorn. A guy that I worked with for years and years, Chuck Abbott, was the Matterhorn expert as far as operational wise. He was the working foreman on that attraction for years and years. Chuck was made a legend the same time I was in 05, which was a fantastic reward and accomplishment that the company gave us.
How did you get over to Walt Disney World at that point in like 1971 to help be a manager at the monorail station?
Well, when I got an invite in 63, 64 from my other uncle Sam. Gave me an invite and wanted me to participate in a war in Vietnam, and so I enlisted in the Marine Corps. And back at that time frame that all males had a service obligation and all employers had an obligation to carry those people on the payroll while they were in the service. So I enlisted in the Marine Corps for a 3-year hitch. And the reason I picked 3 years is because I would have no active duty time. When I got, I'd be inactive duty. Because most of the schedulers weren't real happy with people that were on active duty status, because you had to leave 2 weeks out of the summer, and every month you had 1 weekend that you couldn't work because of your military service. So I ended up going in the Marine Corps. And what I didn't realize is by picking 3 years, it made me eligible to go to all the schools. And somehow I scored very high in electronics, and so they made me an aviation radio repairman. I joined the Marine Corps during the height of the Vietnam War, and I got no more than 82 miles from home. I went through what I call the Battle of Highway 101. Drunk hit me on the head on Highway 101 when I was getting ready to go to Vietnam, to Da Nang. I had orders, and put me in the hospital, tried to kill me. And when I got out of there, I eventually ended up getting mustered out of the Marine Corps on a medical discharge in 1968. That's the same year I got married. So I got married in June of 1968, and I got mustered out of the Marine Corps in August of 1968. Right at that time frame is they started interviewing people to go on Project X. That was Walt Disney World. Part of it is while I was in the Marine Corps, I sort of missed the New York World's Fair, and I was in the Marine Corps when Walt passed, so I wasn't currently working at Disneyland during Walt's passing. I interviewed to go on the opening crew for Walt Disney World. Mm-hmm. And one of my mentors, his name was Pete Crimmings, who I had worked for years and years, he was going to be the manager of the transportation department at Walt Disney World. And he wanted me to run the monorail. And I had told Pete that I had never worked on monorail, and he said, don't worry about it, you'll learn. 1970, I got promoted into management as assistant supervisor, and I got assigned to work with Retlaw, and guess what I got to operate? I got to operate the monorail and the steam trains as a trainee for that. Right after that, they made the decision that they were going to build Tom Sawyer's Island in Frontierland Liberty Square. And I had a little bit of expertise there, so I ended up being transferred from the transportation department into the Frontierland Liberty Square department for the construction of Tom Sawyer's Island and the Richard F. Irvine. Wow. 1972, early 1972, I went into Frontierland Liberty Square. We built Tom Sawyer's Island, and we opened Tom Sawyer's Island, I want to say in May in 1973. And once we finished that project, I ended up getting promoted as manager of rides and attractions for Frontierland Liberty Square. And I went back to Frontierland, and we were going to build this small attraction called Big Thunder. I sort of got another telephone call and asked me if I wanted to be involved in the Epcot project, and said, oh, absolutely. I thought I was going to be a pavilion coordinator, but in turn what they wanted me to do was to operate a warehouse that we stored what we call OFI, owner furnished items. And that was about $400 million worth of materials. And so I did that for the construction of Epcot through Phase 1 and part of Phase 2. And then in 1984, when we went through that whole green mail, and if you've ever read, the storming of the Magic Kingdom and that type thing, well, that's when Michael Eisner and Frank Wells came on board, and I was working for WED PICO, WED Engineering, and which is now WDI, mm-hmm. and PICO stands for Project Installation Coordination Office. Okay, and we were, once things got back on click and that type thing, WED East was sort of a major overhead, so it was dissolved. And at that point, I had the opportunity to make a major career change, and I went from the rides and attraction side of our business to our support side of the business. And I had learned a lot about warehousing working for WED, and so I ended up being made the superintendent of general supplies in October of 1984. And then in January of 1985, the manager of distribution for Walt Disney World went on vacation, Christmas vacation. And I don't know if it was an alien abduction or what, but he didn't come back. And so 6 of us interviewed for the job, and I ended up getting the job as the distribution manager for Walt Disney World. And we went through some gigantic growth all during that time frame. from property wide, from hotel room wise, from movies. Everything just went just escalated, and Frank and Michael make that happen.
You were the go-to guy. You could do anything, basically. You were popping around, and that's amazing.
Yeah, well, I think that's one of the things. Some folks are very focused on their career path. I've always been to the point. I've been very open, and I've been very blessed of being at the right time with the right skill sets in order to move forward in my career. I opened the monorail in '71. And I retired from running the warehouses in 2003.
Wow!
So I've been retired for 17 years. A couple things. I enjoy sharing my Disney heritage, like I am with you, and I get invites to go back out to the property and share it off and on with employees and with different groups. I think the neatest thing going right now is my granddaughter just turned 5. I think I mentioned we had to postpone one of our interviews because I was going to her birthday party. But to be able to see the park through a 5-year-old and watch her grow, I've learned more about princesses in this last year than I did in my entire career. and we do a whole lot of character breakfasts when they come to town. I think that's one of the advantages I have. I do have an annual pass to the park, so I can go in if it isn't blacked out. We had originally planned on going out to Disneyland's 65th anniversary. I hadn't missed one of those since I'd been transferred to Florida, and unfortunately the pandemic sort of shut that down. And we were going to do it as a family, so I had rented a suite in the Grand Californian. So on my list of to-dos is to get ready for Disneyland's 70th.
Tom, you've written a book about this too, so I do want to encourage our listeners to be able to get a copy of it. Do you want to tell them where they can find it and the official name?
Okay, well, if you want it signed by me, then go to my website. It's Tom Nabbe, capital T, capital N.com. 2 words. No space. So TomNabbe.com, and you can order it there. Or if you're an Amazon Prime member, you can go to Amazon, just plug my name into the search column, and it'll bring the book up, and you can order it on Amazon.
I really want to encourage our listeners to definitely go ahead and grab a copy. I'll put the link in the show notes below so you can go ahead and get your copy. And before we end, I have 3 Disney-themed questions I ask all of my guests. So I call them the Fab 3. So we'll start with the Donald one, which is, as a child, what Disney film was one of your favorites to see in the movie theater?
Yeah, the first one I remember vividly of seeing was Bambi.
And our goofy question, what Disney character do you think would be your best friend if you met them in person?
Oh, Eeyore, my role model.
And finally, our Mickey question, if I asked you to name any Disney song at this very moment, what immediately comes to mind?
Zippity-doo-dah.
And my, oh my, what a wonderful day it has been to talk to you, Tom. This has been such a pleasure, and I wish we could have talked more at Retro, and I was like, we're going to definitely do an interview, so I'm so glad this came to be, even a year later.
Well, Okay, well, super. We talked a lot of things, so there's a lot of stories within a stories within a story. So if somewhere in the future I fit into one of your blogs, just let me know.
Oh my gosh, are you kidding me? I definitely want to have you back on.